Hello and welcome to The Toughest Choice. I'm Stephanie Reynolds. I am more than delighted to have Taylor Hawes with us today. And Taylor's current role is the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for Pacific Dental Services. And his primary focus there is on delivering strategies for optimal capitalization, scaled operations, and meaningful business results. Had the good fortune of knowing Taylor for over 18 years, and we met originally years and years ago when he was with Microsoft, and he has played many roles there, but a couple just to mention. He helped develop the strategic plan for all of Microsoft Corporation, designed and delivered business intelligence and reporting systems, and led the planning, budgeting, and forecasting processes. And he also, as CFO of the finance systems and operations and IP, intellectual property, still at Microsoft, he consulted on major deal structures, developed pricing and valuation models for over $7 billion in deals with major technology companies. So it's just a pleasure to have you here, Taylor. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you for having me, Stephanie. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah,
Excited.
it's my pleasure. And what I'm learning in these interviews is that even though I may know and have had the privilege of working with someone for many years, there may be some things I don't know. And so I don't know if you and I ever talked about this before, but I'm just so curious, what led you to becoming a leader? What prompted you to get into leadership?
Well, it's kind of interesting, thinking about that particular question really draws me back to kind of what motivates me and who I am in some respects, right? And, if I go back to when I was a lot younger, before college, before everything, I wasn't a naturally talented person, but I always believed that if I persevered, that I could be successful. And through that perseverance, I did achieve a lot of interesting outcomes. When I was about 15 years old, I went ice skating one day and I was a mess on the ice. And I thought I should be better than that. So I started ice skating and got a job at the ice rink and drove the Zamboni and, did all the things that a young person would do, being scrappy at the ice rink. And when I graduated high school, I moved to Southern California to pursue ice skating and met a partner, figure skating partner. And I was older, and a lot of people told me that I was too old to be successful at ice skating. But I had this dream and I had this kind of passion around trying to do that. And by 1981, my partner and I actually skated in the National Figure Skating Championships. And so it was this mindset that always wanting to persevere to make a difference. So when you ask about leadership, I have a huge desire to make a difference and deliver impact. It's a fundamental belief to me that anything is possible with thought, creativity, and perseverance, right? Similar to how I felt about my ice skating potential, even though many people along the way told me no. It's really a journey of personal growth. You start off as a phenomenal individual contributor because you're just a hard worker, you're doing a great job, and somehow you get recognized for that effort and you transition to being a leader. And at first, as a new leader, we're not great. We tend to micromanage or we tend to be the bottleneck. And we eventually learn that we have to lead with trust. And trust is so critically important because that is a core fundamental belief in how you lead. And so as you migrate from each role, from individual contributor to manager to senior manager to director, and you move up the chain, we have to continue to reinvent ourselves in order to deliver that impact. And essentially, when you talk about you and I going back 18 years, Stephanie, it's a recognition that, in order to move through each stage of leadership and the uncertainty that comes with it, the expectation that comes with it, it's critically important that we continually evolve as leaders. So, there's multiple elements of leadership, but I think it's really that desire for impact. But again, also having empathy and supporting the team, having resilience and courage when you're under pressure, focusing on continuous personal growth, I think are critically important.
Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to unpack. I want to go into that desire because, leaders come to leadership for a lot of different reasons. And I'm hearing that your major threat initially was wanting to make an impact. And if there's a barrier, like for example, you, as your words put it, were a mess on the ice initially, you're like, wait a minute, I can overcome this. There's this belief in inside that drives you, and make sure I'm characterizing this right, that literally drives you to say, wait, okay, I can get better. I can improve. I can win or I can participate in the national champions. I mean, that isn't the first stage, obviously, but it's that determination and perseverance and your
Right.
willingness to evolve.
Yeah, and whatever the subject matter, I've had lots of different careers at Microsoft and lots of different challenges, in front of me. And it's again the perseverance and the belief that I can figure it out, right? And then I can engage people to work with me in order to achieve the outcome that we're trying to drive. But it's this consistent desire to make a difference and have an impact is, I think, what leaders above me recognized in me that has allowed me to continuously move and engage in different topics and add value to the company. And it's really that adding value that is so satisfying and the accomplishment of that, but also working with people in order to make that happen because no one can do it themselves.
I love it. So let's talk about both of those. Let's talk about PDS, your current role, and I'm backtracking a little bit because I'd love to have you talk about impact that you've made there because that's pretty significant. And this may come under the category of, proudest moments, but you'll have those to share with us too if they're not the same. But tell me about your current role and when you joined and to whatever degree you're comfortable, what you accomplished there.
I joined the company nearly 6 years ago. Interestingly, when I joined the company after 25-year career at Microsoft, one of the things I told our CEO is that I've never refinanced any company. Microsoft, we had lots of cash, so I never borrowed a dollar, and I didn't have any experience. And what was wonderful about him is he said, "Well, you'll learn, you'll figure it out." And so in my first engagement in the company, it was a disaster. First 3 months in the company, our CEO asked me to go to the institutional market and borrow money. And I took our financials as they were and our narrative as one of the largest banks helped us put together. And we went to market. The market wasn't receptive to us, let's put it that way. And we kept adding more interest and more interest to our offer in order to syndicate our debt, and they just weren't having it. We just didn't present ourselves in the proper way. So boldly, my first decision independently as the CFO is taking this failed offering that we had in the market, and I pulled it out of the market. I asked them, what our options were. Candidly, they had no option. And so essentially, I pulled the deal out of the market. I renegotiated a bridge loan with our current commercial bank for about $100 million. And then 3 months later, COVID hit. So all we had was $100 million. We had no cash forecast. We had no infrastructure. And I had to navigate through that, believing that I could be the first CFO in this company, a high growth company that was hugely successful, and I'm going to lead it right into the ground.
Oh my
And it
gosh,
was it was a
kind
terrifying
of
moment.
risky.
Yeah. And all I had was that 100 million in cash. And what was really fascinating in all my roles at Microsoft, I always had someone to report to. In this role, Stephanie, I have no one to report to. I report to the CEO. And no matter how nervous, afraid, or concerned I am, I certainly can't go to the CEO going, boss, I'm really nervous about our cash position. We're going under. That's not a strategy. And so his expectation of me is to do my job and make decisions and navigate the company through this crisis, which I did. Yeah, rose to the occasion, knowing that it was a huge challenge. And the first decision I had to make, because President Trump at the time said, if we all isolate for 2 weeks, this thing will pass. Of course, we know it didn't, but we shut the company down completely for 2 weeks. And our head of HR came to me and said, well, Taylor, what do we do with our employees? Do we pay them? Nobody worked a minute. And typically, we're not a company like Microsoft. We don't have that amount of cash. And so I would have paid out 60% of our cash paying that payroll. And essentially, I had to make an ethical decision, Stephanie. I had to decide, do I pay the employees or do I preserve that cash so that we can fight another day? At that point, there's no one to turn to. It's a decision that I had to make myself. And I thought about it for a while. I had to really contemplate, what do we do? What decision do we make around that? And I ultimately decided if this company's going down, I want to do right by the people. I want to treat the employees with dignity and respect. They all have bills to pay. They all have food to buy. They all have families and responsibilities. And so I made the choice to spend the $60 million of my 100 and pay all of the employees. We ultimately furloughed and right-sized the business during COVID, which we had to do. But at the same time, a second decision we made that I think was the right decision is we decided to pay all of the employee portion of their medical insurance. Because COVID was, we were all afraid at the time. And we wanted to make sure that all of our people had full coverage on their insurance plans. And we did that as well. Even though they were furloughed and not making an income, we wanted to make sure that we did that. Well, surprisingly, we ended that quarter. So March to June, we ended that quarter with 20 more million of cash than we started in the quarter. And since 2020, we have grown our bottom line 147% more than the top line growth. I mean, we've had phenomenal profit in the company. To me, as the new CFO, is a blessing because I could restructure the company, reduce the overhead costs of the company, and make it more profitable on a go-forward basis without affecting any employees or without, disrupting any of the strategy or the business that we have. So coming out of that, we went back to market again in 2021. So about 1 year later, and we had 250% oversubscription on our loan. And it was hugely successful for us. And we've never looked back. It's been great. But wow, what a test of...
What a test. You came in that door and I just
yeah,
love
it was a big deal. It was
that
terrifying.
example is why I wanted you on the show so much, because here you are up against it, new organization, not having the deep pockets. You needed to restructure the debt, and then having these ethical decisions that faced, and anyone could logically have rationalized, well, if we kill the goose that lays the golden egg, we won't be able to pay people, down the line. And you made that kind of decision and took that kind of risk.
To be honest, if I were to be absolutely candid and honest, I really contemplated both decisions. It wasn't,
Yes.
it was like 51-49, it was a hard decision to make, but I think ultimately in hindsight, it was absolutely the right decision. And if I was faced with it again, I think I would have to make that same decision. It's just the right thing to do. That's a real test because ethics and making the right decisions are hard. And, it's one of those things where you have to dig deep and say, who am I, at that moment? I'm proud that I made that decision now. It's very easy to, in hindsight, to say, well, of course I would have made that decision, but I'm being absolutely candid and honest about it. And it was a hard decision.
And I so appreciate you sharing that particular story. It's so helpful and speaks to who you are. And in that vein, I'd love to have you talk more about, because you got to bring people along with you. You couldn't just marshal resources and get all these accomplishments, without bringing people with you. And so in the years that you've been in leadership, where has your leadership philosophy evolved to? Where is it now? And how do you lead? How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Stephanie. It causes you to really think about, kind of what, as a leader, what drives you, right? And I have this desire to add value and to have impact, right? So if I were to answer it in a really candid way, I try to lead people how they want to be led. I often put myself in the shoes of who that leader is and what I expect of them. So I have some fundamental belief about people in general. I believe that people want their leaders to have ambition. They want their leaders to stretch and strive and, achieve a meaningful result and call everybody up to a higher calling, if you will, to do more or to reach more and to believe in their capabilities. It's kind of back to John Kennedy talking about man on the moon in a decade. That was a call to everybody to step up a bit and have that ambition to achieve a goal. And I believe that people really want that. I also believe that people want to be supported and empowered to execute. If I believe in them and I empower them and give them the resources to be successful, they absolutely will do that. And so I have to develop skills as a leader to lead with that trust, but also create techniques on how I stay engaged enough to make sure it's on track, right? And then if it's off a track, how do I gently bring it back on track with their empowerment in place, right? In a way that they continue to be successful and move forward. And then I think people want to be recognized for what they accomplished, right? But more than that, what they want is they want to talk about the bigger discussion about their personal goals, their dreams, their potential, where they want to go, and engaging them proactively in that really builds loyalty. It really builds trust. It really builds loyalty because, their ambition may be outside of the company. Why is that bad? I think it's okay for people to have dreams and ambition. And if you can help them achieve that, I think that builds trust and loyalty and it makes them work a little bit harder for you. And then, most important, Stephanie, I have to always recognize the power of my chair. Today I'm the CFO of the company, and I have to do so with reverence and recognition that I have to be congruent with the role. Most people have an opinion of what the CFO does and who that CFO is and whatnot. And so I have to lead with confidence. I have to lead with focus. I have to have high expectations. And I have to drive that expectation even upward with my CEO around what we can achieve, right? And then the recognition that we're all always being watched. People are always looking at us and saying, is he being congruent with what he's saying? Is he behaving like he expects others to behave? That ethic and that trust and the role that you play. As soon as I leave this chair, of course, I'm just another person in the grocery store, right? You know, and so I recognize the power of my role and I try to respect it and lead in a way that is sensible to the role that I have, but also have the humility to understand that my power is relative to who I am right now in the organization in the chair that I sit in.
Mm. Well, I'm appreciating the humility and awareness and the responsibility that you're outlining. I'm so curious about when you have to help people get back on track, because I think a lot of leaders struggle with this one and giving that developmental feedback or helping them out of a role and into another role. I've seen you operate over the years, and I have my own view about how that happens. But can you just elucidate on that just a little bit?
Well, I think you always have to be a truth teller. And one of the things I try to do is separate the truth emotionally versus in the transaction that I'm trying to create. And if I can separate the emotion from the transaction, I think it goes better. So, for example, I listen to podcasts and I was listening to Howard Schultz a while back. And what he was talking about is executive performance, right? And he said, I expect my executives to perform at this level. And if they're performing below that level, I talk to them and say, I really need you to be at this place. That's what I need for the company. And I need you to rise to that level. And if you can't, I have to make a change. It's not about you personally. I like you a ton, but this is what we need. And separating the emotional side of it, I think allows you to make clearer decisions, right? Around what you do with an individual. And candidly, I can work with just about anyone except someone that doesn't care. I don't know how to deal with someone that's unmotivated or doesn't care. It's hard to get people excited if they don't care. So
Absolutely. If they do care, what I've also seen you do is let them know what that bar is, depersonalizing it, as you said, I also have seen you help them scale to that point, either through your own coaching or having them work with somebody else in the organization who may know how to do it a little better, a little differently,
Sure,
helping
always.
them in
Yeah,
other ways of development. Sometimes as a leader, though, you know somebody's not going to be able to hit the mark.
yeah,
And so investing a lot of time and effort there for their sake and yours may not be, but sometimes you don't
yeah.
know, right? Sometimes you got to give them a shot.
Well, you always have to give people a chance, right? And you have to give them your best coaching and the best that you can offer. That's really critically important. One of the things that's really fascinating, Stephanie, and I think this is what is magical about you, is so many people don't believe in their potential. You know, they question themselves and they don't believe in their potential. And they have a lot of fear about things that are not true. You know, I met with a young lady this morning and I told her, people don't just randomly get fired. It's not like the boss walks around and go, well, today you're fired. You know, it doesn't work that way. You have to do something pretty substantial in order to be fired. If you steal money, you'll probably be fired. You know, if you lie, you'll probably be fired. If you bully somebody or harass somebody, those are pretty big things, you know. But for the most part, I think people come to work and they have an unnatural fear about expressing themselves and communicating. And, you know, part of, I think, our jobs as leaders is to help people feel safe and comfortable, right? That they can express themselves, that they can communicate. If I'm wrong, I want someone to tell me I'm wrong. You know, I don't want to walk around thinking I'm right and not be intelligent, right? It's critically important, I think, to build that trust and help people, but also give them the courage to do what they need to do. They often get frozen in fear is what happens. And, you know, I think our jobs as leaders to unfreeze them and give them the confidence that they need in order to take that risk and to step into the chasm, you know, as you talk about oftentimes.
So beautifully said. I'm going to remember that one, record it, and take it with me if you'll let me, because you said it so perfectly. And I love that safety, but also help them unfreeze, move in and move forward despite that fear, not negating the fear, but rather despite it. This is so great. I could talk to you for 2 hours, and I know you're a busy guy. So I'm going to pivot to talking about, you shared a success. I'd love to hear another. And then also maybe some of the most difficult experiences you may have had.
Yeah, so, you know, in terms of impacts that I've had, you know, I could go back to Microsoft and, you know, one of the things that I'm really proud of is I was asked to lead this initiative to create more capacity for the finance teams worldwide to support the business, right? And they were so encumbered with all the accounting and intercompany transactions and all of that activity that they weren't really doing a very good job supporting the country manager in the countries that they supported. So we initiated a project called One Finance. I led that project. It took many months to scope it and define what the project was. You know, we circumnavigated the world multiple times, but ultimately in 18 months, I was able to lead the global outsourcing of all of our accounting and both statutory and management accounting and tax compliance worldwide. We centralized 92 countries around the world into 4 operation centers. We supported 32 languages and followed the sun. It was defined as the most successful outsourcing project in the history of the company, but also won numerous awards within the shared services and outsourcing organizations. And what was really cool is Satya Nadella, Microsoft's current CEO, at the time was running our ERP business. We came to him with a code dev of, you know, about $30 million of code development resources to help him build out one of our ERP products. He said that it was the first time that finance has ever really brought any economic value to his business and that he thought it was wonderful. That was a fun project, and the leader on the project was a challenging leader. You know, he was Swedish, a wonderful, wonderful person, but boy, was he tough and would often use language or behavioral techniques in order to move things forward that may or may not been on the edge of appropriate for from an HR context. And so managing him was a huge challenge for me. And trying to keep him focused, trying to keep him in the straight and narrow, but also allowing him to be fully himself through that whole process, was probably one of my biggest challenges. But again, it was a huge success and one that I really enjoyed leading.
That's such an amazing story. And then just a quick little click in on that. I remember that individual that you're speaking about,
Yeah,
and because I was around during those days with you.
yeah,
And what I recall, and you tell me if this is fair, that, I've seen you do this with folks that may have had some ragged edges around the interpersonal and socialization, but you also see their intelligence, you see their potential, you see their ability. And so this is not just finding the perfect person. You had to pick the best person that you could and then finesse the rest of it with them and throughout the rest of the. Does that seem fair?
I think that's right. He was a trusted leader. He was a country finance person in one of our countries, and so he was trusted by all of the regional leaders and presidents and so on and so forth. So that's critically important. But he was rough around the edges and offensive at times. And what I had to do is contain him, right, and make sure that he stayed appropriate. So, there was some. I don't want to say how I did it, but sometimes calling on someone's insecurity and getting right to the core of who they are and understanding them behaviorally is a way to get alignment, right? And to get behavior into the right place. And so, I had to pull that card a few times, and we have a great relationship, and I think we have mutual respect, and we successfully executed the project. So, doing so without destroying anything, destroying anybody and their personal value, I think takes a little bit of finesse, but I think we were successful in pulling it off. In terms of failures, I think there's a lot of small failures along the way, but I tend to adapt and adjust very quickly. Microsoft isn't a forgiving place to have failure. And so, you always have to be constantly reinventing yourself and thinking through those things. I would say one of the biggest failures I had, I was asked to lead the real estate organization. And in leading the real estate organization, we had an enormous budget and we were remodeling the executive building. And typically what we would do is hire designers and they would mock up a design and all of that. And I was also tasked with redeveloping the campus, the original campus into the new campus. And I was very focused on that. And I wasn't paying very close attention to what was going on for the executive building. And so when they staged what it would look like in basement on the first floor, none of the execs are on the top floor, of course, so they don't see it. It was a disaster. It was in tones that were probably 70s colors and oranges and olives and and very not the executive building, at the caliber and quality that I would expect of Microsoft senior execs, right? And so we were way behind plan, we're over budget, and the carpet was just abysmal. And I had to basically react, respond, and reset very, very quickly. And that was very unpleasant. My boss told me that we needed to replace all the carpet, and he was aware of the failure. And I essentially had to charter 757 to bring the carpet from Atlanta to Microsoft over the weekend and get it installed. And so all of my attention now came to remediating this problem. The woman that was leading it wasn't paying attention either. And again, we had to redesign it. And so if you go in the executive building now, all of the touch that I put on it, you can see the color coordination and the style of it. I think it's quite nicely done. And it ultimately became something that I'm proud of. But Satya wasn't happy, our CFO wasn't happy, my boss wasn't happy, and it was a huge challenge for me to get that righted in very short order. So it took us about a month to get it back on track and at a caliber that our executives deserve. But I would view that as something that I should have paid more attention to, and I didn't get ahead of it when I needed to. And so I did take the hit for that, and it wasn't fun. but I think the end product was right, and we had to really react and scramble to it in order to get it right.
I appreciate it. And I really think that for leaders, if you could share a little bit, because you've had so many ups and big hits, and then, the small ones along the way, the most important takeaways are, I'm going to just leave that sentence open for you. What would you say the most important takeaways are, and for the ones that you haven't done as well?
Well, I think it's really to self-assess. Oftentimes, at least, as I interact with people, particularly my children too, they always want to look outward as to what failed, right? And really, at the end of the day, as you heard me describe it, I didn't place the blame totally on anyone. I said I wasn't paying attention to it, right? I'm the leader of the organization, and all successes and failures accrue to me. So the question is okay, this thing didn't go well. Where was I in that? And what accountability do I have? And how do I remediate? And so, I think it's very important always to self assess and then adjust your leadership, adjust what you're doing. I told you of that failed loan,
Yes,
PDS here.
yes.
I spent hours and hours and hours focused on how does the industry work? What do they expect? How do they view our company? What do we need to do in order to change that view, and understanding the economic side of it as well as the perception of the company? And we've worked very hard to really change that 180 degrees to the extent now, all of our debt is subscribed at 200 plus 250%. And we're the highest rated, lowest leverage in our industry group. I think it's really that self assessment and learning of where the failure occurred and why it occurred. And then what do I do going forward? Not what does somebody else do, but really taking that opportunity to learn from the failure, not apologizing for it. It did occur, and I'm not going to say it didn't. But then what happened to me afterwards, and how did I improve and get better?
Yes. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
perfect and helpful and helpful. And so my last question, which you've covered a lot of ground here, so there's quite a bit of tough choice in what we've heard already, but is there anything that stands out for you that has been your toughest choice or one of the most tough choices that you've had to make?
I can give you an example of a situation that I had in one of our departments. We had a gentleman, a middle-aged gentleman that was mid-50s and didn't do anything specifically wrong, but he was uncomfortably close to a lot of women. Back to the sniffing of the hair kind of close, or the maybe inappropriate comment around attire and clothing, just very awkward in how he interacted with a lot of the women in the organization. And so, of course, there was a complaint, didn't physically do anything wrong, but was just very uncomfortable, and made a lot of the women uncomfortable in the organization. He was a good guy, someone that I really liked and thought a lot about. Technically, he was very good. He executed well, but this complaint arose, and we investigated the complaint. It was founded, right, by an independent review of that. The HR organization recommended that we counsel and coach him. And I thought to myself, he's a 55-year-old guy. He probably has already experienced this in another environment. I don't think it's a counseling coaching problem. And as a leader, I have to assess myself again. What is the expectation of the women that were uncomfortable? And what decision do I make relative to their perception of what leaders should do? And so I had to respect that, and I had to exit him. I made a choice to exit him as a result of that. And so, again, like I said, all eyes are watching you. And what does a leader do? If the women in our organization feel uncomfortable, my job is to remediate that. And I don't think it's a counseling discussion. If I came back and told the team, oh, we're going to put him in counseling, I think the women would say, yep, of course he did
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
and again, I think as a leader you have to make those hard decisions, and this individual lost his job, and now he's got to go home and talk to his spouse as why he lost his job. He's got to deal with that, and he's got to internalize that. But I still believe that that's the right decision, even though it's hard. I had to advocate for the women in our organization that was important. And so that's the decision I made. But again, these are hard choices, you know.
They are, and any woman listening to this will strongly appreciate that. And also men, to know that ultimately, and this is where we started this conversation, Taylor, and where we're wrapping up, is making the choice not just for the organization, definitely for the individuals and the people, and respecting them, respecting the role, and going with your integrity, even though there are potential consequences that could be risky, like losing
Yeah,
a key employee that way.
I think that's important. Yeah. At the end of the day, you have to go to sleep at night saying, did I do the best I could? Right? You're not perfect by any stretch, you know, but I sit in the chair. Did I respect the chair? Did I make the company a better place? And did I accomplish something while I've been here? You know, and it's not complicated, but it is complicated. It's complicated every day,
It's
you know,
easy to talk about.
but in theory, you know, it's not a really complicated orientation, I guess I would say.
I love it. It's clear. That's very clear. I know our listeners will get so much out of this conversation. I have yet again been just touched by how thoughtful you are about leadership and how you lead, and your humility that goes along with that, I know. And also impressed, so impressed with your wonderful accomplishments. So I thank you so much for taking time to be with our audience today. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate you.
Thank you for listening. To hear more conversations with leaders, please subscribe to The Toughest Choice wherever you listen to podcasts. For updates, please connect with me on LinkedIn. This is Stephanie Reynolds. Thanks for listening.